Tonight, the halls are quiet, but the stones remember. Candles gutter along corridors that once decided a man's fate with a whisper. Keys turn. A door opens to a room where law wore silk and mercy kept her eyes closed. We begin in the middle of a night session. No crowds, no shouts, only parchment, wax, and breath. A clerk reads in a low voice. A cardinal nods. The accused waits behind a curtain. Judgment moves like a shadow. This was medieval Rome. Trials sealed by oath, crafted for control, and spoken in a language most people would never hear. In these pages, we walk the narrow path where faith met power. The church was more than prayer. It was a legal world, with rules, penalties, and courts. Popes signed bulls that shaped kingdoms. Cardinals ran hearings that decided what was heresy and what was truth. Sometimes justice was careful, sometimes it was theatre, and often the one above the law wrote the law. You will see how canon law rose from scattered letters into a hard spine, how inquisitors learned to ask without raising a voice, how evidence, confession, and rumour braided into verdicts. You will witness the Cadaver Synod, where a dead pope stood trial. You will step into Avignon rooms where distance softened blame. You will feel the Western schism turn the law into a blade that cut both ways. And you will notice a pattern. When power feared shame, process grew secret. This is not a tale against belief. It is a guided tour through rooms where belief was used like a tool. We will keep the language plain and the light steady. We will bring you close to sealed doors, then listen for what echoes through them. No shouting, no smoke, just a calm hand on the archive latch. Walk with me. The ink is dry, but the choices still speak. The chamber was not grand. Its walls were stone, damp in places where water had found the cracks, carrying the smell of earth into the air. A single lamp burned low, its flame steady but tired, casting halos of light that barely reached the ceiling. Outside, Rome slept, but inside this small room, the weight of decisions pressed heavier than the marble of St. Peter's. A clerk whispered through a sheet of parchment, reading aloud for the record, his voice thin, almost apologetic. The man on the bench, opposite hooded, silent, sat with his head lowered, his hands folded in his lap. Around him, 3 canons stood in shadow. Their robes caught the lamplight, sleeves heavy with folds, their silence louder than any question. Night courts were born, not from mercy, but from necessity. The public trials that took place in daylight were known, their verdicts sometimes swayed by noise, by family names, or by the sheer presence of neighbours pressing into the hall. Night trials stripped all of that away. No crowd, no voices, only the ones chosen to speak, and the accused left to endure. The secrecy was painted as protection for the soul, a chance for judgment without distraction. But for those who sat on the stone floor, it felt like something else entirely, judgment without witness, truth without audience. The Pope's men believed silence purified justice, yet silence has a way of bending. What was spoken in these rooms lived only in the memory of the scribe, whose pen scratched words into parchment with deliberate patience. His choice of phrase could tilt a man's life. His ink was the bridge between what was said and what would be remembered. Imagine the rhythm of these nights, the echo of shoes on stone as guards ushered the accused inside, the careful folding of hands to show obedience, the sigh of wax melted onto seals at the end. There was no gavel, no loud strike to mark the decision. Only a final nod from a presiding cardinal, a soft dismissal, and the shuffle of feet back into the cold air. To sit in night court was to feel time slow. Each word carried a weight greater than its sound. The accused often whispered their responses, fearful of echoes. And yet the verdict, though cloaked in ritual, was often decided long before the man ever entered the room. This was less about seeking truth than about confirming order. Above all, the Pope's hand hovered invisibly over these proceedings. Even if absent, even if unaware of the details, his immunity shadowed the room. Everyone present knew the law bent toward him, not against him. That knowledge settled on the space like a second silence, unspoken but understood. The ritual of Night Court was never about fairness. It was about reminding all who entered that law was not a neutral field, but a tool wielded with care and with carelessness. Judgment here was both sharp and soft, precise yet vague, binding yet hidden. It taught those who left that law was not meant to protect them. It was meant to protect the order they lived within. Night courts faded as dawn approached. The lamps were snuffed, the parchments gathered, the benches left cold. But the decisions lingered, sealed by wax and hidden behind locked doors. To step into daylight after such a night was to carry a secret, that justice had moved quietly in the dark, and no one outside would ever know. The hall was long and narrow, lined with wooden benches worn by countless bodies. At one end stood a heavy curtain, dark green, its folds thick enough to block the draught. Behind it, a single chair, tall-backed and carved with symbols older than the men who sat upon it. The chair was more than furniture. It was a throne of judgment. Placement in the hall mattered more than words. To stand near the curtain was to be hidden, reduced to a voice in the dark. To sit upon the chair was to be seen, elevated above both scribe and accused. This was not by chance. It was design. Where you stood determined what you could risk saying, how much weight your words carried, and whether your silence helped you or harmed you. The accused rarely faced his accuser directly. Curtains separated voices, chairs separated bodies. Justice was not the meeting of equal sides, but the choreography of power. Even the distance between benches told a story. The canons sat closer to the chair, their robes brushing against one another, their proximity suggesting unity. The accused, alone, sat further away, framed by stone, his isolation underscoring his weakness. The ritual of entering the hall was precise. The accused was guided to his place, told where to stand, where to look. He was not free to move, not free to choose. His body was already a statement, controlled, managed, directed. Even his bow before the chair was prescribed, deep enough to show humility, but not so deep as to be mistaken for parody. The chair itself carried no voice, yet it spoke louder than any man. It represented the weight of Peter, the unbroken line of authority stretching from saint to pope. When the cardinal leaned back upon it, his very posture became a verdict. A nod could absolve, a frown could condemn, and still the curtain remained, hiding as much as it revealed. Those behind it could whisper, confer, shift the course of the trial with words the accused would never hear. Curtains shielded not only faces, but accountability. They created layers of distance where truth could be shaped, filtered, adjusted before it reached the scribe's pen. It was said that, even in silence, the accused revealed himself. His posture, his hesitation, his eyes searching the folds of fabric for sympathy. Yet, those watching from the chair or the shadows looked for confirmation, not truth. They read guilt in nervous hands, arrogance in steady stares. The interpretation was theirs to command, and the accused was trapped in their reading. The curtain and the chair became symbols of a deeper lesson. Justice in the medieval church was not about balance, it was about performance. The trial was staged like a ritual, with roles, props, and choreography that reminded everyone present of their place. The accused did not simply defend himself, he enacted submission before a system already leaning against him. And when it was done, the curtain was drawn tighter, the chair left empty, the hall returned to silence. But for the one who had stood apart, the memory of that room lingered. He carried the image of the chair, tall and unyielding, and the curtain that whispered but never spoke. He left knowing that in the theatre of law, his role had been written before he ever stepped inside. The clerk's desk was a small island of order. Upon it lay parchment, sharpened quills, and a shallow dish of hot wax, red as blood in the lamplight. Beside it, a spool of thread wound tight, waiting to stitch judgment into permanence. In the silence after verdict, these tools gave shape to law. Every sentence, once spoken, was fragile. Words could be forgotten, twisted, denied. But once they were inked, tied, sealed, they became weight that could not easily be lifted. The Pope's bulls, the decrees of councils, the verdicts of trials, all moved from fleeting sound to binding order through wax and thread. The ritual was slow, deliberate. The scribe wrote in long strokes, Latin letters curling across the page like vines. Then the parchment was folded, stitched with thread, its edges bound to keep tampering at bay. Finally, the seal. Wax poured, pressed with a ring or stamp, its impression marking the document as untouchable. To break the seal without leave was to defy the Pope himself. Seals were not mere decoration. They were symbols of living authority. A bull carrying the Pope's seal travelled across kingdoms like a shadow of his hand. Kings bowed to its weight. Monasteries trembled at its arrival. Common folk knew its circle of wax could change lives overnight. The law was not the words alone. It was the impression of power pressed into wax. Thread held the sheets together, but it also carried meaning. It bound decisions as though binding souls. Once stitched, the parchment could not be altered without leaving scars. Each knot was a promise that the record was whole, untouched, as sacred as Scripture. To see thread was to see the permanence of what had been done. The smell of wax lingered in archives, sweet yet sharp, a scent that reminded clerks and scholars alike that they were touching not just parchment, but verdicts, sentences, the very weight of law. To unroll a sealed decree was to unroll history itself, to feel in one's hand the lasting shadow of a pope's decision. And yet, wax could crack, thread could fray. A seal broken by time or heat could render a judgment doubtful. So the Church built layers, multiple copies, duplicate seals, redundant threads. They believed that permanence could be forced upon fragile things, but permanence is always an illusion. Still, in its time, wax and thread made law into something more than memory. It gave decisions a body, a form that could travel, be touched, be feared. The accused who left a trial might vanish into obscurity, but the parchment bearing his sentence would live on, carried in chests, stacked in libraries, cited by men who never saw his face. In this way, wax and thread became not just tools, but symbols of the Church's deeper power. They reminded all who read and all who signed that law was not a conversation. It was a substance, hardened, bound, sealed beyond question. The flame dimmed, the wax cooled, the thread was tied, and another life, another verdict, another night of judgment was captured forever in silence. The voice that filled the chamber was smooth, trained, and relentless. It carried words most of those present could not follow. Latin was the language of the Church, and in its folds lay both inclusion and exclusion. For clerks and judges, it was the air they breathed. For the accused, it was a wall thick, high, and unyielding. Imagine sitting before men who hold your life in their hands, listening as sentences unfold in a language you only half recognize. The rhythms are familiar. You have heard them in Mass, in hymns, in blessings over bread and wine. But the meaning, the details, the sharp edges of law slip past you like water through fingers. You nod when expected. You wait for a gesture or a translated phrase to give you direction. And in that gap of comprehension, decisions root themselves deeply. Latin was never chosen by accident. It was a mark of authority, an invisible barrier that reminded everyone who held knowledge and who did not. The clergy lived within its grammar. They shaped arguments with terms so precise they could cut like knives. Accused men and women, often simple villagers, carried only fragments of understanding. To them, words like heresis, fides, poena sounded distant, abstract, yet those syllables determined whether they would walk free, pay, kneel, or burn. Translators sometimes stood between the court and the accused. Their task was to soften, to bridge, to carry Latin's sharpness into the familiar tongue. But even here, danger lurked. A word mistranslated could tilt the meaning, shift the guilt, alter the path of judgment. And not every clerk was careful. Some enjoyed their power as the only voice the accused could truly follow. Inquisitors understood the weight of words. They knew the authority of language went beyond meaning. It lay in the sound itself. To hear Latin spoken with gravity was to feel law pressing down, even if one did not grasp each phrase. The cadence of chants, the measured pace of decrees, the formal opening lines, all reminded the listener of scripture, of ritual, of power that was never to be doubted. The accused sometimes tried to answer in their own tongue, desperate to explain, to plead, to make themselves clear. The court listened with faces blank, then turned to the clerk for translation. By the time the answer returned in Latin, it had passed through another man's judgment. Was it faithful to the speaker, or adjusted to fit the needs of the hearing? Only those in the shadows knew. Latin was the cloak under which trials hid their decisions. It gave proceedings the air of sacred ritual. It linked the court with the altar, the verdict with the creed. It turned what might have been seen as politics into something divine, untouchable, unquestionable. To challenge a sentence written in Latin was not simply to question a man, it was to question the church itself, and by extension, the voice of God. Yet, for all its solemnity, Latin also betrayed the limits of justice. Those who truly understood it often played with it, twisting grammar, shaping loopholes, finding ways to bend rules without breaking them. What seemed holy was also flexible. What seemed eternal could be rephrased. The accused, locked outside that game, never had a chance. Every word spoken in those chambers was written down, filed, and sealed in the archives. Centuries later, the documents remain, their letters sharp, their phrasing deliberate. Reading them now, one hears the echo of a tongue both sacred and sharp, designed to bind not only bodies but minds. Latin was not only a language, it was a weapon, and in the dim candlelight of medieval trials, it cut more deeply than any sword. The room shifted whenever the Pope's name was spoken. It was not spoken lightly, and never without pause. Those present would lower their eyes, some crossing themselves, others simply bowing their heads. For the Pope was more than a man in Rome. He was the one who could not be tried, the one who sat above the law. This immunity was not written on walls, nor shouted in the streets. It lived in custom, in precedent, in the careful silence of those who would not dare to imagine otherwise. To suggest the Pope could stand before a judge was to suggest Peter himself might be questioned. And so the circle of protection was complete. The judge of all could never be judged. It was a curious paradox. The Church built itself on confession, on the idea that all men must answer for their sins. Kings had knelt barefoot in snow before popes, begging absolution. Merchants had lost fortunes, peasants their homes, when found guilty of offences great and small. But the Pope, whose words could bind kingdoms, stood apart, shielded from the very system he commanded. The immunity was justified as necessity. If the Pope could be tried, then who would judge him? If one could sit above Peter's successor, then the line of authority itself would fracture. Better to place him beyond reach than to risk collapse. And so, even when whispers grew loud, when rumours of corruption drifted through the streets of Rome, the official stance remained. The Pope answered to God alone. This did not mean popes lived free of fear. They knew their immunity was fragile, not in law, but in politics. A council could gather. A rival could rise. A king's sword could force concessions that no canon ever would. Immunity was sacred, but it was also practical, and those who wore the tiara understood its delicate balance. The Cadaver Synod revealed how fragile that shield could be. A dead pope, Formosus, was dragged into court, propped on a throne, and made to face charges. His immunity once absolute, crumbled under the pressure of living enemies who feared his legacy. If a pope could be tried after death, then was immunity truly eternal? The trial ended with Formosus condemned, his body mutilated, his reputation torn apart. But the spectacle also exposed the truth. Immunity was not divine decree, but human choice, wielded when convenient, broken when useful. Still, in daily practice, the rule held. No matter the rumour, no matter the suspicion, the Pope remained apart. His words were verdict, his silence protection, his immunity, the cornerstone on which all else was built. It reminded the world that law was not equal for all. Some lived under it, some lived above it. For clerics, this truth was a lesson. To rise in rank was to climb toward a place where law became softer, where judgment was delayed, where immunity grew stronger. Each promotion was not only honour but armour. Those at the bottom felt law's weight most heavily. Those at the top shaped it, softened it, or ignored it as needed. Above and apart, the phrase itself whispered a warning. Justice in the church was never blind. It saw rank clearly, adjusted its gaze, and shielded the crown even as it crushed the commoner. The Pope's immunity was not only about him, it was a symbol to all. The higher you rose, the lighter the burden of law became. And in the quiet halls of trials, that knowledge shaped every word. The accused bowed not only to judges but to the unspoken truth that no judgment could ever climb higher than the man who wore the tiara. The trial could not begin until the keys were turned. Heavy iron, they fit into locks that squealed like old animals, their sound echoing through stone corridors. The man who carried them was not a cardinal, not a judge, not even a clerk. He was the chamberlain, the usher, the one whose presence went unnoticed by many, yet held the power to open or close the very doors of judgment. Every trial depended on such figures. They carried documents from desk to desk. They placed candles in their holders, arranged benches, swept the floor before dignitaries arrived. They guided the accused to his seat, whispered instructions, fetched water, delivered messages. To watch them was to see how law depended on details. The chamberlain's authority was quiet, but real. With a nod, he could delay the start of a hearing. With a misstep, he could embarrass the accused or sway the room's mood. He was the keeper of order, and in a world where ritual mattered as much as verdict, his control over ritual gave him power. Keys were his symbols. They did more than open doors. They secured chests where parchments lay, sealed cupboards where wax and thread were kept, locked drawers where evidence, letters, coins, even relics were stored. The chamberlain decided when those doors opened, who entered, who touched what lay inside. Without him, law could not move. Small offices carried hidden weight. The notary who wrote, the usher who arranged, the scribe who whispered translations all shaped outcomes in ways unseen. They were not remembered in chronicles, but their fingerprints marked every page. The accused might speak bravely, the judge might pronounce with solemnity, but it was the minor officials who ensured the trial flowed, who placed the right parchment before the right man at the right time. Some chamberlains grew corrupt, trading favours for coins slipped quietly into their hands. A delayed document, a missing seal, a door locked too soon, all could tilt a case without anyone able to prove fault. Others were loyal to the core, devoted to keeping ritual pure, their pride resting in perfect order. Both kinds shared the same truth. Without them, the law's performance faltered. The keeper of keys stood as a reminder that law was not only theory, not only theology, but practice. It depended on hands that carried wax, eyes that checked seals, voices that whispered instructions. It depended on men who would never sit on the tall chair, yet without whom the tall chair would remain empty. Keys clicked in locks, doors opened, the trial began, and somewhere in the back, unseen by most, the chamberlain stood with the ring of iron at his belt, knowing that without his touch, the law would remain silent. The court was already heavy with silence when the first murmur entered. A neighbour said she had heard. A servant said he had seen. A merchant said he had been told by someone whose name he could not remember. Whispers moved like smoke, hard to grasp, yet filling every corner of the room. And in the dim light of trial, smoke became flame. In medieval justice, whispers were not dismissed as idle talk. They were gathered, weighed, shaped into fama reputation. If a man's name was carried too often in the mouths of others, the court treated it as proof that something must be true. Reputation itself became evidence, not the act, not the witness, but the repetition of rumour. The law leaned upon the weight of what people said when doors were closed and voices lowered. Imagine standing accused not by one man, but by the very air of your village. The baker recalls that you argued with a priest. The miller repeats a tale told by his cousin. The widow remembers a strange word muttered at dusk. Each story alone is thin, perhaps laughable, but together, tied with thread and ink, they harden into a wall of presumption. It is no longer you against one voice. It is you against the echo of many. The court recorded these whispers carefully. Scribes wrote them down as testimony, their quills turning rumour into text. Once inked, a murmur carried weight equal to fact. The accused might protest, deny, call witnesses of his own, yet even his defence was shadowed. To say everyone is wrong was to seem defiant. To beg that whispers meant nothing was to draw more attention to them. Silence, too, could be used against him. The Church claimed this practice was pastoral. Whispers revealed hidden sins, sins too dangerous to leave unchecked. A heretic might be clever, hiding his true thoughts, but reputation betrayed him. If enough people believed, then surely something must lie beneath. It was safer to try, safer to condemn, than to risk that rumour was truth. Better for one man to suffer wrongly than for heresy to spread. That was the reasoning, at least. But whispers were not pure. They were born of anger, jealousy, rivalry. A neighbour slighted at market, a cousin denied inheritance, a priest humiliated by laughter, all could plant seeds of suspicion. Once spoken, they travelled faster than correction, and when gathered into court, they transformed into something almost holy. Judges bowed to the chorus of rumour, treating it as if it spoke with the voice of God. Many accused learned that their fate had been decided long before they entered the hall. Their words mattered little when the court had already weighed the whispers. Trials became confirmations, not inquiries. The accused could feel it in the way the judges looked at them, in the way scribes prepared extra sheets of parchment, in the way guards stood ready before questions even began. Whispers as evidence taught the people a quiet lesson. Words could wound more deeply than blows. To guard one's tongue was not only moral, it was survival. To keep neighbours pleased, priests satisfied, merchants friendly, was not courtesy, it was armour. A careless phrase, a bitter argument, a misstep in confession, could become the root of ruin. The people learned to live cautiously, watching their speech, softening their anger, hiding their doubts. The Church's courts believed they had discovered truth through reputation, but what they had truly built was fear. Whispers as evidence was less a tool of justice and more a net. It caught the guilty and the innocent alike, binding both with the threads of rumour. In the archive, the words remain, scribbles of servants, notes of neighbours, voices long gone. They speak not of acts, but of suspicion, of talk, of rumour hardened into law. And they remind us that in those halls, truth was less important than the story told often enough to be believed. The room was small, almost plain, a chair for the accused, a table for the clerk, and a candle that guttered when the door opened. There were no irons on the walls, no whips, no racks. The men who questioned did not shout. They did not strike. They spoke softly, like priests in confession. Yet the weight pressing on the accused was heavier than any chain. The Church called it voluntary confession. The words were chosen carefully. The accused was meant to admit freely, without force. But freedom was a fragile thing when seated before men in robes, men whose eyes carried both pity and judgment. To refuse was to risk harsher trial, deeper suspicion. To confess was to open the possibility of mercy. The choice was there, but narrow, tilted, heavy. Confession was prized above all else. Evidence was fragile, witnesses uncertain, rumours unreliable. But confession, whether true or crafted under pressure, became the jewel of the court. It sealed the verdict with a clarity no other proof could match. A man who confessed condemned himself. A woman who whispered her guilt saved the court the trouble of weighing rumour. To the Church, confession was both justice and salvation. But how was confession drawn without chains? The inquisitors had their methods. Questions repeated until the accused faltered. Promises of lighter penance whispered like balm. Gentle pauses, long silences, the kind that stretched until a man filled them with words to escape the pressure. Sometimes scripture was read aloud, verses about sin, about cleansing, about salvation through truth. The accused, weary, frightened, began to believe that speaking was the only path to peace. Confession could be partial. A man might admit to doubts, not heresy. A woman to careless words, not blasphemy. Yet the court would press further. If you admit to doubt, then surely heresy lurked nearby. If you confess to careless words, then perhaps belief lay beneath. What began as small admission grew into full surrender, and all of it, every word, was written down. Some confessed to escape silence. The endless sessions, the same questions, the candle burning lower, the faces never changing. Time itself became a weapon. Days blurred. Meals grew small. Sleep was restless. Until one morning, the accused gave in not because the accusation was true, but because the burden of denial was heavier than the burden of guilt. Confession without chains was painted as mercy. Better than torture, better than flames, better than the rack. But in its own way, it was more subtle, more insidious. It worked not on the body but on the soul. It asked the accused to surrender not under pain, but under the weight of conscience, of fear, of silence. The chains were invisible, yet they bound more tightly than iron. The scribes treasured these words. Once inked, confession was stronger than rumour, stronger than witness. It could not be denied. It could not be explained away. It lived on parchment, sealed with wax, proof that the law had done its work. Even if spoken in exhaustion, even if whispered in despair, confession became truth. The accused who confessed sometimes left lighter, believing mercy would follow. But mercy was a thin promise. Some were given penance, long pilgrimages, prayers that stretched for years. Others, despite their confession, still met the flame, their words serving only to confirm guilt before death. Confession without chains revealed the paradox at the heart of medieval justice. The Church sought truth, yet prized obedience more. To confess was not only to admit guilt, it was to acknowledge the power of the court, to bow before it, to surrender the self. That was the true victory the inquisitors sought. Chains were not needed. Words, once spoken, bound far tighter than iron ever could. The trial began with simplicity. No complex charges, no long readings. Just 3 questions, asked with calm, steady voices. They were the heart of the matter, the axis around which the whole proceeding turned. Do you believe the faith of the Church? Will you obey its authority? What was your intent? The first question reached into the soul. Do you believe the faith of the Church? It was not enough to say, yes. The court wanted more. They asked for details, for signs, for words that matched the creed. A man who stumbled over phrases, a woman who hesitated before answering these small cracks was seized upon as proof of doubt. To believe was not only to assent, but to recite, to echo, to sound like the Church itself. The second question tested loyalty. Will you obey its authority? Here the matter of discipline entered. Even if faith was pure, would you bend the knee to law? Would you submit to correction? Would you accept the verdict before it was spoken? Obedience was not only about heresy, it was about control. The Church feared not only false belief but disobedient spirit. To say, "I will obey," was to surrender in advance, to bind oneself before hearing the sentence. The third question pierced intention. What was your intent? Words could be excused as error, actions forgiven as mistake, but intent revealed the soul. Did you mean to question the priest? Did you mean to spread doubt? Did you mean to walk away from the fold? Even if the accused denied intent, the court could interpret silence, hesitation, or contradiction as hidden purpose. In their eyes, the intent was often worse than the act. These three questions seemed simple, yet they carried endless weight. They touched every layer of trial, repeated in different forms, pressed again and again. To falter on one was to risk guilt. To falter on all was to invite condemnation. The accused often entered, believing they could defend themselves with honesty. They left, realizing honesty was not what the court sought. The court sought alignment, faith in words, obedience in spirit, purity of intent. Anything less was heresy. The questions were asked softly, without anger. They were not shouted like accusations. They were delivered with patience, as though giving the accused every chance to step back into the fold. But beneath the softness lay steel. The questions were traps, designed to catch, to bind, to close the circle. Answering yes was never enough. Prove it, repeat it, live it, seal it with obedience. For those who watched, the process seemed almost pastoral. A shepherd asking sheep to declare their place in the flock. But for the accused, it was suffocation. Each answer drew them deeper into a net. Each hesitation was magnified. The questions were not invitations. They were tests one could not win. The three questions lived on in records, written again and again, echoed across centuries. They reveal how the Church's trials were less about crimes and more about conformity. Belief, obedience, intent. Three strands twisted into a rope. A rope that bound, that tightened, that pulled the accused toward verdict. In the end, these questions asked not what a man had done, but who he was willing to be. A believer, obedient, pure in intent, or a heretic, guilty, condemned. The line was thin, the space between narrow, and in that narrowness, countless lives were judged. The hall was still. The accused sat on the bench, shoulders low, head bowed, lips pressed tight. He had spoken before, but now his words were gone. Every question that came from the clerk's lips met only air. The scribe dipped his quill and wrote anyway, because in this place silence had a meaning of its own. The court did not allow silence to be emptiness. They shaped it, gave it weight. A man who did not answer was treated as though he had admitted the charge. A woman who hesitated too long was judged as though she had confessed. Silence was dangerous because it left space for the judges to decide what it meant, and they always decided in the same direction, against the accused. The reasoning was simple, or so they claimed. Truth was clear, truth was light. An innocent man would cry out, an innocent woman would speak. If they did not, then they must be guilty. Silence became consent. To remain quiet was to agree. But was it agreement, or was it fear? Many who stood before the court knew that words could be twisted. They had heard stories of neighbours whose answers were copied down wrongly, reshaped in Latin, recited back with edges they had never meant. To stay silent was, for some, the only shield left. Better to speak nothing than to be trapped by one's own tongue. Yet even this defence failed, because silence itself was used as a weapon. There was a cruelty in the way the judges leaned forward, waiting. They gave space for words to come, nodding, pausing, as though patient. Then, when none came, they signalled to the scribe. A line of ink, and the accused's fate tilted further toward guilt. The very act of holding one's breath became evidence. Silence was read differently, depending on who sat in judgment. A powerful man might pause and be seen as careful, measured, thoughtful. A villager pausing too long was seen as evasive, stubborn, unfaithful. Silence mirrored rank. Those above could use it to their advantage. Those below had it turned against them. Some accused tried to break this trap by speaking constantly, filling the hall with words, hoping the flow itself would protect them. But this too could be twisted. Too many words were called confusion, defiance, or arrogance. Too few were called guilt. Between the extremes lay no safe ground. The silence of the hall was not natural silence. It was thick, filled with expectation, like the pause before a storm. The accused sat in the centre of it, knowing every moment of quiet would be measured. The guards shifted their feet. The scribes waited with quills poised. The judges leaned back, faces unreadable. And the weight grew heavier until the stillness itself was unbearable. What began as a refusal became surrender. Silence as consent became a lesson that law was not only about what one said, but about what one could no longer say. It taught those who left the hall that silence was dangerous everywhere. Better to speak quickly, to agree, to echo, than to hold one's peace. Better to fill the air than to let others shape its meaning. And so silence, once a natural shield, became a trap. A man might walk into court, believing he could defend himself by saying nothing. He left realizing that nothing had spoken louder than words ever could. It began with letters. A bishop in one province wrote to Rome with a question: what to do with a priest who refused to obey? A monastery sent a message about property stolen by a noble. A king asked how to punish men who married within forbidden degrees. These letters arrived on papal desks, sometimes in piles, sometimes one by one, each carrying the weight of a local dispute. The Pope, or those writing for him, answered. Sometimes the response was brief, a few lines, a suggestion, a ruling. Sometimes it grew long, detailed, full of citations from scripture and earlier cases. These replies, once sealed, became more than answers. They became models. What the Pope had said in one place could be used in another. One decision began to shape many. Over time, the pile of letters grew too large to ignore. Clerics began copying them, binding them, arranging them in order. They sorted them by subject: marriage, inheritance, penance, heresy. What began as private correspondence turned into public rule. Local disputes hardened into universal law. The process was quiet, almost accidental. No one decreed at first that these letters would form a code. But necessity pressed. Priests and judges needed guidance. They looked to Rome, and Rome's replies filled the gap. Soon, what had been words written to one man became rules binding thousands. This shift was powerful. It meant the Pope's pen reached further than his voice. He no longer had to be present. He no longer had to hear each case himself. His letters carried his authority across borders, into villages, into homes. Law was born not in grand councils, but in ink on parchment. But there was danger too. Letters written in haste could be copied and treated as timeless truth. Replies meant for one place were read as universal. The nuance of context was lost. A pope answering a single case might never imagine his words being quoted centuries later as binding law. Yet that was what happened. The people in villages often did not see these letters. They felt their weight indirectly when priests told them what was allowed and what was forbidden. The rules seemed eternal, as though carved in stone. Few realized they had begun as questions, as conversations, as exchanges of ink between distant men. From letters to law, the Church created a system that could expand endlessly. Every new question added to the pile. Every reply gave new authority. The archives swelled, and with them grew the power of the papal voice. It was no longer just advice. It was decree, precedent, command. And in this transformation, the nature of justice shifted. Local customs bent under the weight of Roman words. Old traditions were replaced by papal rulings. A practice, once tolerated in one land, became forbidden because a letter said so. The reach of law stretched wider, binding more tightly, until even kings found themselves caught in its net. The journey from letters to law reveals a truth. Authority grows not in leaps, but in layers. 1,000 small answers become a mountain of precedent. What begins as guidance becomes command. And, once sealed with wax, once copied into books, it becomes almost impossible to undo. In a quiet corner of Bologna, around the middle of the 12th century, a monk named Gratian began his work. He was not a pope, not a king, not even a bishop of renown. He was a teacher, troubled by the tangle of rules that filled the church. Letters contradicted letters. Customs clashed with customs. Councils had spoken in many voices, and no one knew which words carried greatest weight. Gratian saw chaos where there should have been order, so he began to gather. He collected canons, decrees, letters, and rulings. He read them carefully, copied them, arranged them. He compared old words with new, weighing contradictions, seeking balance. When one law seemed to oppose another, he wrote notes to reconcile them, offering explanations, pointing to deeper principles. His aim was not merely to collect, but to harmonize. The work grew vast. Piece by piece, Gratian stitched the fragments of church law into a single cloth. The result became known as the Decretum. It was not official papal law, not at first. It was a monk's effort, a teacher's manual. Yet it was so thorough, so clear in its structure, that it became the backbone of canon law for centuries. Students gathered to study it. Teachers built lessons around it. Judges cited it. Popes leaned upon it. Gratian's Decretum gave the church something it had lacked, a spine. No longer did law float in fragments. Now it had form, sequence, order. The Decretum was more than a collection. It was a vision. Gratian believed law should reflect both justice and mercy. He wrote not only to command, but to guide. He tried to show that contradictions in the law could be resolved if one understood the deeper harmony of the church. To him, order itself was divine, chaos dishonored faith. Law, shaped and structured, honored God. But order has its cost. Gratian's work, though meant as a teaching tool, quickly became authority itself. What he wrote as explanation became binding. His attempts at harmony sometimes silenced older voices, pushing them aside in favor of neatness. His structure gave clarity, but it also gave rigidity. Law became more uniform, but less flexible. Still, his achievement cannot be overstated. The Decretum turned scattered letters into a system. It taught generations how to think about law, how to argue, how to decide. It gave the church a common language for justice, a shared framework that stretched across nations. In the candlelit classrooms of Bologna, students traced Gratian's words with their fingers, memorizing them, carrying them back to their towns. They became judges, bishops, clerks, all carrying the spine he had given them, and through them, his vision spread until the very idea of canon law could not be imagined without his work. Gratian himself faded into obscurity. We know little about his later life, but his Decretum lived on, copied, glossed, expanded. It became not just a book, but a foundation. A monk in Bologna had given the church its backbone, and with it the ability to stand tall, to endure, to command. Gratian's spine still lies beneath the body of law today, hidden beneath centuries of additions. His hand is quiet, but his order remains. And it reminds us that sometimes the most lasting power comes not from the throne, but from the desk, from the careful hand of one who sought only to make sense of the chaos around him. The city was restless in the summer of 1234 when the papal scribes began their work. Rome itself hummed with merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers, but in the quiet rooms of the Lateran, The sound was different, the scratching of quills on parchment. Pope Gregory IX had decided it was time to bring the sea of scattered decrees into a single binding net. The Decretales, his great collection, would be woven like threads into a web that could stretch across Christendom. Before Gregory, canon law was already thick with Gratian's Decretum and countless papal letters. But the problem was clear. There was too much. Letters overlapped, contradicted, or carried weight in one place, but not in another. Bishops wrote one thing, councils another, and local customs still ruled in the spaces left between. Law, instead of clarity, was confusion. Gregory wanted something else, certainty. So the scribes gathered texts. They copied old rulings, papal rescripts, conciliar canons, and decisions from Rome's courts. They weighed which ones to keep and which to let fall away. They polished language, cut redundancies, and arranged the whole mass into 5 books. Each book held titles, each title chapters, each chapter precise words that were to bind the faithful as tightly as Scripture itself. The Pope had not just created a code, he had cast a net. Once completed, the Decretales were copied and sent outward. The parchment bundles travelled on mules, on carts, in leather satchels carried by messengers. They arrived at universities in Bologna and Paris, at cathedrals in Cologne, Toledo, Canterbury. Wherever they arrived, they replaced older custom. Local habits and half-remembered rulings gave way to Rome's net. What had once been diverse and uneven was now uniform, tight, unavoidable. The power of the collection was not in its words alone. It was in the authority it carried. Gregory declared it binding for all of Christendom. No bishop could set it aside, no king could dismiss it. If a question arose in a far-off village, the answer was no longer sought in custom or tradition, but in the pages of the Decretales. The law of Rome had stretched over them like a fisherman's net, holding fast even the smallest fish. But nets do more than catch, they entangle. Once inside, it was hard to move without touching another thread. A question about marriage might pull on rules of inheritance. A question about penance might tug on questions of obedience. Everything was woven together, interlaced, bound. This was the genius of Gregory's net. It made the law not only broad, but connected. Every thread reinforced the others. To break one was to strain the whole. The people, of course, rarely saw the pages. They felt them instead. A marriage annulled, a tithe demanded, a priest disciplined. Each was an expression of Gregory's net at work. Priests and judges became interpreters of the code, carrying its words into daily life. Its language was in Latin, but its weight was in every village. Not all welcomed it. Some bishops resisted, clinging to local custom. Some kings bristled at Rome's reach, muttering that papal law was invading royal courts. But the net was patient. Even when cut in one place, it spread in another. Universities trained new clerks in its use, and soon the very men who advised kings spoke in its language. Resistance became harder. To ignore the Decretales was to appear ignorant. To dismiss them was to look lawless. Gregory's project was both brilliance and burden. It brought clarity where chaos had reigned, but it also bound the Church to the rigidity of written code. Once ink was dried, it was not easily bent. Later popes would add, amend, and adjust, but the structure remained, the net held fast. Centuries later, scholars still speak of it as the moment when papal authority became legal authority. Gregory IX did not simply issue rulings. He built a system in which every ruling, past and future, could be caught, shaped, and sent outward. The fisherman had cast his net, and all of Christendom found itself within. The council halls smelled of incense and sweat. Bishops in heavy robes sat in long rows, their croziers leaning against wooden benches. At the front, beneath a crucifix that stretched high above the assembly, scribes unrolled parchment, ready to catch each word spoken. To most, a council was a gathering for faith. To those who watched closely, it was also a courtroom. When councils met at Lateran, at Lyons, at Vienne, they did not only speak of creed, they judged. They tried men, ideas, practices. They summoned clerics, nobles, and sometimes whole communities to stand before the collective weight of Christendom. The decisions rendered were not whispered verdicts in small chambers, but thunderclaps spoken aloud, echoed by the voice of hundreds. At the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, heresy itself was judged as though it were a living defendant. Canon after canon was read, defining what must be believed, condemning what must not. To disobey these lines was not simply error, it was crime. In the same session, clerical corruption was put on trial. Priests were warned, bishops were bound, rules were set. The council had become both altar and court. At Lyons in 1245, the drama grew sharper. Pope Innocent IV presided as Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, was summoned. The council treated him not as a sovereign beyond their reach, but as a man to be judged. Charges were read: heresy, sacrilege, perjury. The emperor was absent, but it did not matter. The verdict was pronounced. He was deposed, stripped in words of his crown. A council had passed judgment on a king, as though he were any other accused. The council's authority lay in their scale. A single judge might be doubted, a single pope might be resisted, but when hundreds of bishops spoke together, their voice carried the weight of heaven itself. They framed their verdicts as universal, binding not only the accused but all who lived under the Church's shadow. These gatherings also revealed law's theatrical side. The processions, the banners, the chants, all lent gravity to decisions that were, at their core, judicial. To condemn heresy amid incense and hymn made it feel less like punishment and more like purification. To depose an emperor before the eyes of Christendom made it feel less like politics and more like divine justice. Yet beneath the spectacle lay the same patterns as the small courts. Accusations, questions, verdicts. Witnesses were heard, though often selectively. Evidence was weighed, though more often assumed. The difference was scale, not substance. A council was a courtroom draped in splendour. The records of these councils remain thick with legal language. They read like case files, full of charges, defences, penalties. Marriage laws were codified, defining who could wed and who could not. Rules for confession, for penance, for the sacraments were declared with binding force. What had been debated in cloisters became fixed law, carried outward by bishops returning to their dioceses. For the ordinary faithful, the impact was immense. Suddenly, marriage within the seventh degree of kinship was not merely frowned upon, but forbidden. Suddenly, priests were bound to new standards of conduct, with penalties spelled out in detail. Suddenly, heresy was no longer just a whispered suspicion, but a crime defined and punishable. Councils spoke like courts, and their words reached into every home. Councils also reminded kings that their crowns were not immune. When an emperor could be condemned, when kings were called to defend themselves, it became clear that papal law reached even the highest thrones. The message was stark. In the eyes of the Church, no one stood above judgment, at least, no one except the Pope himself. Thus, the council became more than meeting. It became tribunal. Its hymns masked its verdicts. Its processions framed its sentences. Beneath the chanting voices, the sound of law echoed, sharp and final. The young man stood trembling before the bench, expecting the harsh sound of chains. Instead, the judge leaned forward and spoke softly. "You shall walk to Santiago. You shall walk with bare feet, carrying no purse, and you shall pray at every shrine along the road. No cell, no whip, no gallows, only a journey." This was penance as sentence. For centuries, the Church preferred penance to prison. Where kings and lords locked men in stone towers, the bishops sent them to roads, altars, and prayers. Sin was not to be punished by iron, but healed by ritual. The courtroom became an extension of the confessional. A crime against law was also a wound against God, and wounds required healing more than chains. Penance varied. Some were told to fast for 40 days, to give up meat, to live on bread and water. Some were sent on long pilgrimages, Rome, Canterbury, Compostela, walking until their feet blistered, their bodies worn down to humility. Others were ordered to recite prayers, hundreds at a time, until their voices cracked. And for the gravest offences, penance stretched for years, binding a soul in constant acts of contrition. To modern eyes, it seems lenient. To those who endured it, penance could be as heavy as prison. A pilgrimage across Europe was no light task. It meant leaving home, leaving family, risking robbers, hunger, and storms. A year of fasting carved the body thin, left the spirit weak. Endless prayers drained strength as surely as hard labour. And the shame was public. Villagers knew who had been sentenced, and they watched him walk the long road, whispering. Yet the logic was clear. Penance promised healing. Where prison bred resentment, penance offered the hope of salvation. A man who completed his journey returned not only free, but purified. The court had punished him, yes, but also restored him. The sentence was both justice and cure. Still, not all accepted it. Some mocked it, claiming the church traded punishment for spectacle. Pilgrimages, filled with convicts, became parades of shame. Monasteries took in penitents and profited from their offerings. Even the wealthy found ways to soften their penance, hiring others to walk on their behalf, paying to shorten their fasts. Mercy, it seemed, could be bought. The line between penance and prison blurred as time passed. Inquisitors, less patient, began to see penance as too soft. Heretics were not merely sinners, but dangers, and dangers required walls. The practice of imprisonment began to creep into canon law, first as temporary, then as lifelong. Still, the tradition of penance never vanished. It remained a hallmark of the Church's way of judgment, punishment tied to salvation. In the candlelit halls where verdicts were read, the words carried both fear and hope. To be told fast, walk, pray, was to face hardship, yes, but also to glimpse mercy. To be told burn, hang, chain was to lose all chance. Between penance and prison lay a gulf not just of punishment, but of meaning. One path sought to cure the soul, the other sought only to contain the body. And so penance lingered, woven into the sentences of countless trials. It reminded all who heard the verdict that crime was never only crime, it was sin, and sin demanded not just payment, but healing. The Church's law bound bodies, yes, but it bound them always, with eyes on eternity. The hall was dim, but the seat prepared for the accused was higher than most. Not a rough bench, not the cold stone floor, but a cushioned chair set apart. The accused was no commoner. He wore the vestments of a priest, a man ordained by holy oil, hands once blessed to touch chalice and altar. Yet even he, under the law, was summoned to stand trial. Clerics carried a special weight in medieval society. They were servants of the Church, bound by vows, protectors of sacraments. To the faithful, they were intermediaries between earth and heaven. To rulers, they were administrators, scribes, and advisors. And yet, when accused of crime, whether theft, heresy, or worse, they did not face the same fate as ordinary men. Their trials revealed one of the most striking divides in medieval law, the benefit of clergy. This privilege was old, rooted in the claim that no secular court had the right to punish one consecrated by God. Priests accused of crime were withdrawn from lay judges and brought instead before ecclesiastical courts. Their cases were heard not by king's officials, but by bishops, abbots, or delegated judges. And their sentences, when guilty, rarely echoed the harsh blows dealt to laymen. Where a thief might lose his hand, a cleric might be sent to penance. Where a murderer might hang, a priest might fast or live under house arrest. To the Church, this was not corruption but theology. The body of a cleric was consecrated, set apart. To mutilate it was to harm not only the man but the office he carried. Punishment for clerics had to preserve the sacredness of their role, even if their actions betrayed it. Better to cleanse with prayer than destroy with rope. But to the people who watched, the divide stung. They saw priests shielded, while common men burned. They saw abbots judged gently, while villagers lost fields, families, or lives. Resentment grew, whispered in markets, muttered in taverns. The law bends for those in robes. Not every cleric escaped. Some trials revealed the full weight of ecclesiastical judgment. Accusations of heresy, especially, could strip away the veil of privilege. A priest found teaching against the faith was more dangerous than a layman, for his words carried authority and his flock trusted him. In such cases, the church showed no hesitation. The benefit of clergy dissolved, and the priest was judged with severity, sometimes even handed to the secular arm for execution. Other crimes brought strange sentences. A priest caught in theft might be removed from his parish and confined to a monastery, forced to live in silence, cloistered until death. A bishop accused of corruption might be deposed, stripped of office, and reduced to simple monkhood. Punishments aimed not at the body, but at the dignity of the office. To be lowered from bishop to priest, from priest to layman, was considered a punishment worse than chains. The trial of clerics also revealed the politics of rank. Bishops judged priests, popes judged bishops, councils judged cardinals, and always, above all, the Pope himself stood immune. Each level of rank carried its own layer of protection, each trial shaped by the question, how much dignity can be stripped and how much must remain untouched? Scribes recorded these trials with careful detail, noting the charges, the replies, the judgments. Their records reveal the tension at the heart of the matter. A law that claimed equality before God, yet practiced inequality before man. The idea that priests should be judged differently was defended with scripture, yet it often looked like privilege. The faithful bowed to their priests at the altar, but in private they wondered what justice truly meant when robes shielded guilt. Clerics on trial show us the double edge of medieval law. On one side, reverence for the sacred office, protection of consecrated hands. On the other, resentment, anger, and suspicion. Justice for clerics was never about one man alone. It was about the balance between reverence and resentment, faith and fairness. And in that balance, many lives hung suspended, judged not by their deeds alone, but by the vestments they wore. It was said that saints could not be touched. Their names carried weight heavier than gold. Their relics, their shrines, their stories offered protection even to those who only brushed against their memory. And in the courts of the church, this belief in holiness shaped more than prayers. It shaped immunity. Immunity by halo was not written in codes, not spelled out in canon. It was lived in practice. Those who carried a reputation of sanctity, bishops, beloved by their flock, abbots famed for their charity, priests whose sermons brought tears, were judged differently. Their holiness acted like armor. Accusations slid off, whispers grew faint. Even when charges were brought, the halo of sanctity bent the process, tilting verdicts toward mercy. The idea rested on theology. If holiness was evidence of God's grace, then to accuse the holy was dangerous, even presumptuous. Who would dare declare guilty the one whose prayers seemed to heal, whose presence inspired devotion? To condemn such a man might be to condemn God's work itself. In practice, it meant that some men lived untouchable. Their reputations became shields against rumour. Villagers hesitated to speak against them, fearing both social scorn and divine retribution. Judges hesitated to condemn them, fearing to stain their own hands with the blood of a living saint. The halo carried power not only in chapel light, but in courtroom dark. Yet immunity by halo could be weaponized. Ambitious clerics sought to cultivate reputations of holiness, not only for spiritual reasons, but for protection. Fasting, giving alms, preaching with fire, these acts were not only devotion, but defense. The holier the image, the harder the law pressed against them. A carefully polished reputation could deflect suspicion, delay inquiry, soften verdicts. When genuine saints stood trial, the tension was worse. Stories tell of men accused, yet supported by their flocks with tears and pleas. The court found itself in a bind. To condemn meant uproar, riots, scandal. To acquit meant suspicion of weakness. Often, compromises were made. Lighter penances, quiet transfers, sentences written in gentle ink. This halo did not only protect the living, it guarded the dead as well. Once canonized, a man's name could no longer be tarnished. Any whisper of fault was silenced, any memory of error erased. Trials of saints did not exist, because sainthood itself was treated as proof of innocence. The halo reached beyond the grave, rewriting memory itself. The resentment of this privilege grew quietly. Common folk noticed. They saw neighbours condemned for whispers, while abbots escaped heavier accusations. They saw priests lifted high for charity, even while rumours lingered of hidden sins. They saw the law bow before halos, and they wondered if holiness was truth or power dressed as truth. Immunity by halo was never absolute. Some saints fell, their reputations stripped, their stories reshaped as warnings rather than praise. But even then, the process was slow, reluctant, painful. To strip a halo was to strip not only a man, but a community of its symbol. It happened rarely, and when it did, it left scars. The records of these cases remind us that justice was never blind. It saw halos clearly, and halos shone brightly in court. Holiness, whether genuine or staged, tilted verdicts, bent judgments, and shaped law as powerfully as Scripture itself. The accused learned that reputation could save as surely as innocence. The people learned that justice bowed not only to truth, but to the shimmer of sanctity. The small courtroom in a distant village was never the end. No matter what verdict was spoken, fine, penance, exile, the accused could raise his voice with 3 words: appeal to Rome. Those words lifted the case from local benches to the highest chair in Christendom, the seat of Peter himself. Appeal to Peter was not a phrase of desperation. It was strategy. It meant delay, distance, and often mercy. Local judges, bound by custom and pressed by community, delivered harsh sentences. Rome, far away, moved slowly. Appeals bought time, sometimes years. They shifted the trial from local passions to distant procedures. For the accused, it was often the only hope. The right of appeal was rooted in theology. The Pope was successor of Peter, shepherd of the universal church. If Peter had the keys to bind and loose, then his successor must have the power to hear all cases. No verdict could be final until Rome itself confirmed it. This principle gave every Christian, even the humblest villager, the right to lift his case to the highest court of faith. The journey was not easy. An appeal meant travel, sometimes across mountains, through storms, across borders. It meant money, for messengers, for parchment, for bribes to clerks who moved cases through the piles. It meant patience, as months turned to years. Yet for those condemned at home, it was a journey worth the cost. In Rome, appeals filled the papal chancery. Scribes sorted them, copying, filing, arranging. Some were read quickly, dismissed with a phrase. Others lingered, debated, referred to cardinals or councils. A few reached the Pope himself, his seal pressed in wax as the final word. Often the appeal ended not with reversal but with compromise. Sentences were softened, fines reduced, penances shortened. Rome sought not to overturn justice entirely, but to temper it, to balance zeal with mercy. The Pope became both judge and arbiter, shaping verdicts with an eye toward unity rather than division. But the system carried dangers. Appeals clogged the chancery, overwhelming clerks. Delays grew so long that some died before their cases were heard. Wealthier appellants could buy better representation, Higher advocates, skilled in canon law, grease palms along the way. Poorer men, lacking coin, found their appeals languishing in the dust of archives. Justice was accessible, but not equally. Still, the principle stood. No case was too small, no judge too distant. The shadow of Rome stretched across Christendom, and every villager knew he could invoke it. Whether or not it saved him, the possibility alone reminded local judges that their word was not final. They judged under the gaze of Peter's successor, and that gaze restrained them, at least a little. Appeal to Peter reveals the paradox of medieval justice. It gave the Church a universal face, binding all under one authority. It offered hope where none might otherwise exist. But it also revealed inequality, delay, and manipulation. For the poor, it was promise without guarantee. For the rich, it was shield and sword alike. The archives in Rome still hold those appeals, rolls of parchment filled with pleas. They are voices carried across mountains, across seas, voices of men and women who clung to the idea that above every judge stood Peter's chair, and above every verdict the seal of Rome. The table was narrow, worn smooth by hands that had gripped it in fear. A single candle stood at its centre, dripping wax into a shallow dish. On one side sat the inquisitor, his robe plain but his presence heavy. On the other, the accused, often trembling, sometimes defiant, always aware that the balance of his life might rest on how this conversation unfolded. The inquisitor's table was not a battlefield. It was quieter, subtler. Here, the weapons were questions. The inquisitor did not shout, did not rage. He leaned forward, voice measured, words deliberate, as if coaxing truth from the soul rather than forcing it. He asked not only about actions, but about thoughts, not only about deeds, but about beliefs. What do you hold in your heart? Who do you meet with at night? What prayers do you say when no one listens? This was the heart of the Inquisition, not simply to punish heresy, but to uncover it, to pull hidden doubt into the open. The inquisitor believed he was surgeon, not executioner. Heresy was a disease, and his questions were the knife that cut it out. Yet for the accused, the knife cut deep, and often it cut wrongly. The table was also a stage. The inquisitor sat with authority that carried both spiritual and temporal weight. He was not only judge but confessor, not only officer but priest. The accused was expected not only to answer but to repent. Silence was suspicion. Defiance was guilt. Confession was salvation, but also evidence. The paradox could not be escaped. Scribes recorded every exchange, quills scratching like the steady beat of a drum. They noted hesitation, contradictions, words spoken, and words left unsaid. Once inked, these records became the backbone of trial, shaping verdict long after the candle burned down. The inquisitor's table also served as a filter. Many who came before it were not burned, not imprisoned, but redirected. They were given penances, fasting, pilgrimages, alms. They were scolded, warned, released. The table caught not only the guilty, but the wavering, drawing them back into obedience before their doubts spread. It was both courtroom and pulpit, shaping not only verdicts but faith itself. Yet the table was feared, for mercy was never guaranteed. Some inquisitors were relentless, pressing until confession broke from weary lips. Others were patient, preferring long hours, repeated questions, silence stretched until it suffocated. To sit across from them was to feel that every breath, every glance, every tremor of the hand was being measured. The accused rarely felt equal. They entered barefoot, heads bowed, while the inquisitor sat steady, unmoving. Even the candle's light seemed to favour his side of the table. The imbalance was clear. One questioned, the other answered. One judged, the other was judged. In time, the inquisitor's table became symbol. It was remembered in whispers, painted in chronicles, feared in villages. To be summoned, there was to be marked. Even if acquitted, the stain lingered. Neighbours looked differently, whispers followed. The table left shadows long after the trial was done. But the church defended it. Better to save souls through questioning than to let heresy spread unchecked. Better to root out doubt than to let it poison the flock. The inquisitor's table was presented as mercy, a chance to confess, to return, to live. Yet to those who sat at it, it often felt less like mercy and more like judgment, disguised as conversation. The table remains in memory as one of the starkest images of medieval justice. Not gallows, not flame, but wood and candle, question and answer. It was here, more than anywhere else, that the line between salvation and punishment blurred, where mercy and terror sat together across the same flame. Before the law of Rome spread, before papal decrees shaped every corner of Christendom, there were older ways of judgment, ways that did not rely on parchment or scribes, but on the elements themselves. Trials, by fire and water, ordeals they were called, ancient, primal, terrifying. The accused was brought to a place where the ritual could unfold, sometimes a churchyard, sometimes a riverbank, sometimes a hall where fire was stoked high. Priests prayed over the scene, calling God to witness, to reveal truth. For the belief was simple. If the accused was innocent, God would show it. If guilty, the elements would betray them. In trial by fire, the accused might be made to carry a piece of red-hot iron, bare hands wrapped around the glowing metal. He walked a measured distance, dropped it, and then his wounds were bound. Days later, the bandages were unwrapped. If the flesh was healing clean, he was innocent. If festering, guilty. Fire became the judge, its burn either wound or sign of grace. In trial by water, the accused was bound and lowered into a river or pond. The belief was reversed. Water, pure and holy, would accept the innocent and swallow them, but reject the guilty, leaving them afloat. To sink was salvation, to float was damnation. The image was cruel, drowning as proof of innocence, life as proof of guilt, yet communities believed, and priests blessed the waters before the plunge. These trials were not hidden, they were public, surrounded by villagers who watched with breath held. They wanted certainty. They wanted God's judgment visible. To see a neighbour burned or drowned was to see truth revealed without dispute. The ordeal was spectacle, binding community in shared belief. But ordeals carried dangers. Fire burned, both innocent and guilty alike. Water drowned as often as it revealed. Many saw the cruelty, the randomness, the despair. Yet for centuries they endured, defended as divine. Better to leave judgment in God's hand than in the uncertainty of men. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the Church began to distance itself. Canon lawyers argued that ordeals were superstition, not true justice. Councils forbade priests from blessing iron or water for trials. Slowly, the rituals faded, replaced by written law, by questioning, by inquisitors' tables. Yet their memory remained, a reminder of a time when law was elemental, when earth, fire, and water were called to speak for heaven. The ordeal revealed something deep in medieval justice, the hunger for certainty. Courts feared false verdicts, feared punishing the innocent. The ordeal, for all its brutality, offered clarity. No one could argue with burned hands or drowned bodies. To believe was to accept that God had spoken. When ordeals ended, people felt both relief and unease. Relief that fire and water no longer tormented their neighbours. Unease that now judgment lay once more in human hands, fallible, corrupt, uncertain. The ordeal had been cruel, but it had been certain. Without it, certainty became harder to find. Trials by fire and water belong to the older world, yet their shadow lingers. They remind us that justice has always sought signs beyond itself, always feared its own weakness, always longed for proof that it acted rightly. Whether by fire, by water, or by ink on parchment, the same hunger remained, to see truth made visible. The square bustled with voices. Merchants sold spices, cloth, tools. Farmers brought chickens, cheese, wine. And among the stalls, Quietly, but unmistakably, another trade took place: penance. The marketplace of penance was not marked by banners, but everyone knew where to find it. Confession had long been tied to penance fasts, prayers, pilgrimages, but over time, penance became negotiable. A man condemned to walk to Rome could pay another to walk in his place. A woman sentenced to fasting could substitute alms, feeding the poor instead of starving herself. Penance became a kind of currency, tradable, transferable, commutable. The Church allowed it, even encouraged it. Better that good be done in many forms than that sinners fail entirely. Alms fed the hungry, built churches, supported monasteries, substituted pilgrimages, still honoured shrines, even if by proxy. The logic was practical, the effect visible. Yet it also turned penance into commodity. Soon, entire markets grew around it. Agents offered to carry out pilgrimages for a fee. Monasteries accepted donations in place of fasting. Priests negotiated terms with wealthy penitents, adjusting punishments according to purse. A man with coin could lighten his burden. A man without coin bore the full weight. The marketplace of penance was not only tolerated, but institutionalized. Indulgences, remissions of penance granted by authority, entered circulation. At first, small and local, they grew into vast systems. Crusaders were promised indulgence if they took the cross. Donors were granted indulgence if they funded cathedrals. The forgiveness of penance became an economy, spreading across Christendom like trade routes. For the poor, this created bitterness. They saw neighbours buy freedom from punishment while they walked barefoot in dust. They heard priests speak of mercy, but watched mercy sold like spice or wool. For the wealthy, it became habit. Sin confessed, coin offered, burden lifted. The spiritual turned financial, salvation touched by silver. The Church defended the practice as mercy. Why not let wealth serve the poor? Why not channel punishment into charity? Better, they argued, that sinners pay and heal others than suffer alone. But the line between mercy and market blurred until it could scarcely be seen. Markets of penance shaped more than lives, they shaped law itself. Courts issued sentences with built-in escape clauses, pilgrimages that could be paid away, fasts that could be commuted, fines that doubled as charity. Judgment became not only spiritual but financial. Parchments recorded not just guilt and penance, but coin and substitution. This marketplace sowed seeds of change. By the late Middle Ages, voices rose in protest. Too much mercy bought, too little justice seen. Too many priests with purses fattened, too many poor still burdened. The practice, meant to ease the system, became its scandal. It would one day fuel reform, rebellion, and fire across Europe. Yet in its own time, it was simply part of life. To walk the market was to pass stalls of bread, of wine, of cloth, and to know that, if coin was in your hand, even your soul's burden could be lightened. Penance had become trade, and in that trade lay both mercy and betrayal. The small wooden confessional was dim, the air inside thick with incense and secrets. On one side knelt the penitent, head bowed, whispering fears and faults into the lattice. On the other sat the priest, silent except for the murmurs of response. Between them stretched an invisible wall, the seal of confession, the most sacred silence in Christendom. The seal meant that no word spoken in confession could ever be repeated, not to parents, not to kings, not even to judges. The priest was bound absolutely. He could give counsel, impose penance, urge repentance, but he could never reveal what had been said. To break the seal was unthinkable, a crime worse than heresy itself. This silence gave confession its power. A man could pour out his darkest thoughts, knowing that the law of the Church protected him. A murderer could whisper of his crime. A thief could admit to stolen goods. A heretic could reveal his doubts. The priest heard all, absorbed all, but carried none outward. The words died within the sacrament. Yet the seal carried tension, especially in the courts. Judges wanted evidence, trials demanded truth, but priests could not speak. Even when a man confessed guilt in the confessional, the words could not be brought forward as proof. A murderer might go free, a heretic might live, simply because the knowledge of guilt was locked in sacred silence. For inquisitors, this silence was both shield and obstacle. They urged penitents to repeat confessions publicly, to admit in court what they had whispered in secret. Some did, seeking forgiveness. Others refused, clinging to the safety of the seal. The priest could not help, even when truth burned on his tongue. The seal also protected priests themselves, for in the confessional they heard not only sin but rumour, doubt, gossip. They learned of feuds, affairs, crimes. They held the pulse of their communities in whispered words, but they could never wield it openly. Their power was immense, but their silence made it invisible. This silence was not without danger. Kings pressed priests, demanding they reveal confessions of treason. Lords demanded names of conspirators. Priests who refused risked exile, prison, even death. Yet canon law stood firm. The seal was absolute. A priest might die rather than betray it, and some did. Martyrs of silence, remembered not for words spoken, but for words withheld. The people believed in this seal as deeply as they believed in the Eucharist. They trusted it, depended on it. Without it, confession would collapse. Who would reveal sins if priests could speak them aloud? Who would whisper guilt if they feared the courtroom? The seal held the system together, a silent wall guarding the most fragile of human truths. In medieval trials, the seal stood as a reminder that law had limits. There were places it could not reach, words it could not hear. Even the most powerful inquisitor, even the mightiest king, could not pierce it. The seal belonged to God, not man. Centuries later, the seal still stands. In dusty parchments, in whispered stories, in legends of priests who died for silence, it remains unbroken. It teaches that sometimes justice is not in knowing, not in revealing, but in holding silence so deeply that not even death can break it. The chamber was bare, its stone walls damp with the smell of iron and straw. A rack stood in the centre, its ropes coiled, its wheels ready. In the corner, iron tools lay cold and silent until needed. Few saw this room, but all feared it. For here, beneath the glow of torches, the shadow of torture stretched over every trial. The use of torture in medieval courts was not casual. It was formal, bound by rules, justified by law. The argument was simple. When evidence was lacking, when confession was absent, torture could reveal truth. The body, it was said, could not lie. Pain would draw forth what silence concealed. Yet everyone knew that pain does not reveal truth. It reveals desperation. A man on the rack will say anything to stop the ropes. A woman stretched beyond endurance will confess to crimes she never imagined. Torture produced words, but words bent and twisted by agony. The Church tried to control it. Canon law set limits. Torture could not be lethal, could not be repeated endlessly, could not be used without clear indications of guilt. But these limits were porous. What was lethal? What was endless? What counted as indication? Judges stretched the rules as easily as they stretched limbs. Torture became ritual. The accused was led in, shown the instruments. Sometimes this alone broke resistance. If not, the ropes tightened, the irons heated. Questions were asked, repeated, demanded. The scribe recorded every word, ink catching truth and lies alike. Once confessed under torture, the accused was asked to repeat the confession freely, later, to make it valid. Many did, broken in body and spirit. The shadow of torture extended even where it was not used. The mere possibility bent trials. Accused men confessed quickly to avoid it. Witnesses spoke carefully, knowing what awaited if contradictions appeared. Judges wielded the threat as weapon, sometimes never needing to carry it out. Fear was enough. Defenders of the practice argued that it protected society. Heresy was poison, treason a plague. To let one heretic slip free could endanger thousands. Better to risk error than to risk contagion. Torture, they said, was not cruelty, but necessity. But the accused, bound and broken, rarely saw it as mercy. The records of trials tell grim tales, confessions of witchcraft, of heresy, of blasphemy, extracted in screams and sealed in ink. Yet behind the words we glimpse the fear, the desperation, the silence of those who knew truth had little to do with survival. Torture shaped the memory of the courts. It made the church feared not only for its verdicts but for its methods. It made law feel less like shepherd and more like hunter, and it left scars on bodies, on families, on faith itself. The shadow of torture remains in history as warning. It shows how far law can go when certainty is demanded at any cost, how quickly justice can turn into cruelty. In the dim chambers, where rope and iron spoke louder than truth, the pursuit of purity became the breeding ground of fear. The hall was cold when she entered, her veil drawn low, her steps careful. Men filled the benches, judges, clerks, scribes, all eyes upon her. To be a woman before the bench was to stand exposed, not only to questions of law, but to the weight of custom, suspicion, and expectation. Women in medieval trials faced a different burden. The law was written by men, spoken by men, judged by men. Women's voices were often doubted, their words treated as weaker, less credible. To accuse as a woman was to risk dismissal. To defend as a woman was to risk disbelief. The courtroom was not only a place of judgment, but of imbalance. Yet women appeared often, accused of theft, of sorcery, of heresy, called as witnesses in disputes of marriage, of inheritance, of family quarrels. They carried truths, but truths filtered through prejudice. A woman's testimony might be dismissed unless confirmed by men. A widow's words might carry weight if tied to property. A maiden's silence might be read as consent. In cases of marriage, women were central yet voiceless. Trials examined whether consent had been given, but often men spoke for them, fathers, brothers, guardians. A girl's whispered assent could be twisted into binding vow. A woman's protest could be ignored if it threatened alliances. The court claimed to guard the sanctity of marriage, yet it often silenced the very women whose lives it decided. Accusations of sorcery fell hardest on women. Their knowledge of herbs, of childbirth, of healing became suspect. Rumours painted them as witches, their remedies as spells, their independence as threat. In court, these accusations were framed as heresy, as pacts with demons. Women stood alone, surrounded by men who saw in their skill not wisdom but danger. Torture weighed heavily here, dragging confessions from lips burned by fear. Yet not all women were powerless. Some noble women wielded influence, using courts to secure dowries, to defend lands, to challenge rivals. Queens could stand as protectors, abbesses, as judges in their own right. The imbalance was real, but cracks appeared. Through those cracks, some women carved authority. Still, for most, the bench was hostile ground. Their bodies were questioned, their chastity examined, their words doubted. The law claimed objectivity, but its gaze was shaped by suspicion. Women were seen as more easily deceived, more easily tempted, more easily fallen. Scribes recorded their words with care, but also with bias. They noted tears, gestures, tremors, often using them as signs of guilt. Men's anger could be righteous. Women's sorrow could be manipulation. The same gesture meant different things depending on who performed it. For women, standing before the bench meant standing not only against accusation, but against expectation itself. Their guilt was presumed, their innocence fragile, their voices, even when heard, were filtered through the quills of men who did not trust them. The memory of these trials lingers, stark and painful. Women were judged not only for what they did, but for who they were, their very nature treated as suspect. The bench was never level for them, and in that imbalance, countless verdicts were sealed, countless lives reshaped by a system that weighed gender as heavily as guilt. They arrived without warning. A red hat or a silver cross glimmering above the crowd was enough to silence an entire town square. Papal legates were the living arm of Rome, sent to carry the Pope's authority into places he could not reach in person. Their presence at a trial turned ordinary judgment into something more, a performance of papal power. When a legate walked into the hall, all other voices lowered. Bishops bowed, judges paused, clerks waited for his nod. He did not simply represent Rome, he embodied it. His words carried the weight of Peter's successor. His seal was the Pope's own hand. For the accused, the shift was immense. What might have been a local quarrel suddenly became a matter of universal law. Legates often came with missions, sometimes to judge disputes between bishops, sometimes to discipline monasteries, sometimes to oversee trials of heresy. They sat at the head of benches, their robes clean and their tone firm. They asked questions not only about guilt, but about loyalty. Do you obey the Pope? Do you recognize his authority? The trial became less about individual crime and more about alignment with Rome. The legates carried written instructions, papal bulls sealed with lead. These were unrolled in public, read aloud, and posted on doors. The sight of the seal alone was enough to chill dissent. No bishop, no abbot, no lord dared resist openly. To defy the legate was to defy Rome, and that meant excommunication, loss, ruin. But legates were not only judges, they were diplomats, politicians, collectors. They demanded tithes, gathered money for crusades, secured promises of loyalty. Trials were one tool among many, used to ensure obedience. A priest accused of heresy might be punished, yes, but the trial also reminded the whole community who ruled. The Pope might be far away, but his eyes and hands were near. The people watched with awe, sometimes resentment. They saw wealth flow toward Rome, discipline pressed harder, local customs overridden. Yet they also saw disputes settled with finality, corrupt bishops checked, law made uniform. The legate's presence was both feared and welcomed, depending on who you asked. Scribes wrote carefully of these visits. Records described towns filled with processions, churches draped in banners, halls crowded with villagers. The trial itself might last hours, but the memory lasted years, for a legate's judgment was not easily undone. Legates embodied the truth of medieval law. It was not local, not national, but universal. They reminded everyone that justice flowed from one source, through one figure, across one system. To see a legate preside was to glimpse the long reach of papal authority, a reach that could stretch from Rome to the farthest village. Their work carried shadows. Some were accused of greed, of taking bribes, of using trials for profit. Others were remembered as stern but fair, men who carried Rome's will with integrity. In every case, their presence marked a turning point, the moment when the local bent to the universal. For the accused, this often meant despair. To appeal to Rome when Rome itself sat before you was no hope at all. The legate's table was the end of the road. His verdict was final. His authority beyond question. The Pope might be far away, but his voice was here, close enough to hear, close enough to condemn. The hall was crowded, yet when the word was spoken, silence fell. Excommunicatus. The accused lowered his head, for this was more than sentence, it was exile from the soul of Christendom. Excommunication was the most dreaded verdict the court could deliver. No chain bound tighter, no flame burned hotter. To be cut off from the sacraments was to be cut off from life itself. Excommunication meant more than exclusion from church. It meant isolation from community. No Christian could share food with the excommunicated. No neighbour could trade with them, no family could bury them in consecrated ground. They were outcasts, alive yet already dead to the body of the faithful. The ritual was stark. A bell tolled, a book was closed, a candle was snuffed. These gestures symbolized the cutting off of light, the sealing of salvation. The accused stood, while the priest intoned the formula, often in Latin, the words echoing against stone walls. With each phrase, their separation grew. When the candle flame died, hope itself seemed to vanish with the smoke. Excommunication was not always permanent. The Church used it as both punishment and pressure. To be reconciled, the sinner had to repent, confess, perform penance. The process might take months, even years. Until then, life was suspended, markets closed, neighbours shunned, even family ties strained. For medieval people, who lived in constant fear of death without sacrament, the weight was unbearable. The courts wielded it with precision. A thief might be fined, a heretic imprisoned, but one who defied the Church, who resisted authority, who refused to obey, was excommunicated. It was less about crime and more about obedience. To fall outside the Church's law was to fall outside its life. Excommunication could be collective. Entire towns faced it when they resisted papal orders. Kings themselves were struck when they quarrelled with Rome. The thunder of excommunication shook nations, sparking rebellion, shifting alliances. When a ruler was cut off, his subjects were told they no longer owed him obedience. Law and politics entwined, all through a single word. For ordinary people, excommunication carried terror. Stories spread of crops failing, of sudden deaths, of eternal damnation awaiting those who died under the ban. Some believed demons tormented the excommunicated, dragging them to ruin. The verdict was more than law, it was cosmic. Yet excommunication also carried corruption. Some bishops used it as weapon, striking rivals with the ban to secure power. Some communities learned to live with it, continuing life despite the Church's curse. Others saw it as bargaining tool, lifted when money was paid or loyalty sworn. The holiness of the penalty was sometimes tainted by the politics of its use. Still, the power was undeniable. No secular punishment carried such weight. Kings might imprison, lords might execute, but only the Church could strike at the soul. The fear of eternal exile ensured obedience where chains might fail. The records of excommunication fill parchment with names, dates, or formulas. But beneath the ink lies something deeper. The memory of isolation, the terror of being severed not only from men but from God. For those who heard the bell toll, who saw the candle die, it was more than trial's end. It was the end of belonging, the beginning of exile without end. In the halls of Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, students bent over parchment, quills scratching notes beside dense Latin texts. Professors paced, robes swaying, voices rising in dispute. The canonists' debate was a world away from the village courtroom, but its influence stretched into every trial. For here, in lecture halls filled with ink and argument, the laws of the Church were sharpened, tested, and reshaped. The canonists were scholars, men who dedicated their lives to interpreting Gratian's Decretum and the papal decretals. They treated the law as scripture, dissecting phrases, comparing cases, reconciling contradictions. When one text allowed penance and another demanded prison, they asked which carried greater weight. When one pope forbade and another permitted, they asked how truth could remain one. Their debates were not idle. They became the foundation upon which judges ruled. The method was precise. A question was posed. Could confession under torture be valid? Could a bishop excommunicate a king? Could a woman testify against a priest? Students listened as professors argued both sides, citing texts, spinning logic, weaving principles. At the end, a resolution was offered, clear, firm, and practical. These resolutions travelled outward, carried in the memories of students who became clerks, bishops, inquisitors. The debates often seemed abstract, but they shaped real lives. A canonist's conclusion on the limits of torture meant the difference between mercy and agony. His ruling on women's testimony shaped inheritances, marriages, or families. His argument about papal authority decided wars. In dusty classrooms, the future of Christendom was written in ink and voice. The debates also revealed tension. Some canonists leaned toward mercy, emphasizing repentance over punishment. Others leaned toward discipline, demanding strict obedience. Some saw the Pope as supreme in all things. Others allowed limits, arguing councils could correct him. These arguments were not only academic, they reflected real struggles within the Church, struggles that echoed in every trial. The style of debate itself shaped law. It demanded clarity, precision, to structure. It trained judges to think in terms of precedent, to weigh texts as evidence. No longer could verdicts rest on whim or tradition alone. They had to be argued, justified, defended. The courtroom became an extension of the classroom. Every trial an echo of scholastic method. Yet the canonists were also criticized. Their endless parsing of words, their love of subtle distinctions, their tendency to lose sight of life in pursuit of logic, these drew mockery. Some said they turned faith into arithmetic, mercy into syllogism. Others accused them of arrogance, of placing human reasoning above divine inspiration. Still, their influence was undeniable. Without them, the law would have remained scattered, incoherent. With them, it became system, framework, doctrine. They gave judges tools, gave trials structure, gave verdicts authority. The canonists' debate reminds us that law is not born only in courts. It is born in classrooms, in books, in arguments that stretch late into the night. It is shaped not only by verdicts, but by questions. And those questions, once asked, never quite disappear. They linger, pressed into parchment, whispered in lecture halls, carried into the judgments of every age. The square filled long before dawn. Men and women pressed shoulder to shoulder, children perched on walls, merchants setting up stalls as though for a festival. But this was no feast day. At the centre of the square stood a scaffold, and beside it, a stake. The air was tense, every eye fixed on the wooden platform that promised both spectacle and warning. Execution in the medieval world was not hidden. It was staged, prepared, and witnessed by as many as could gather. For the church and the courts, it was theatre, the final act of judgment made visible. A man condemned for heresy, a woman convicted of sorcery, a thief unrepentant, all were brought here to show what law could do when defied. The condemned often entered the square barefoot, ropes around their wrists, escorted by guards. Sometimes a procession led them, with priests chanting litanies, urging repentance, even at the last breath. The crowd watched not only for punishment, but for drama. Would the condemned confess, deny, or curse? Every word carried weight, remembered long after the flames died or the axe fell. The scaffold itself was part of the message. Raised high, it ensured no one missed a detail. The gallows, the block, the pyre, all were symbols as much as instruments. Each form of death carried meaning. Hanging marked shame, burning marked impurity, beheading marked dignity or treason. The body became a text, read by the crowd as clearly as any parchment. The executioner, often feared and shunned, played his part with ritual. His hood, his tools, his gestures, all added to the drama. He was not only killer, but actor, performing law's will before the eyes of the people. A swift stroke brought murmurs of relief. A clumsy blow brought gasps, even pity. In both cases, the memory seared into those who watched. For the Church, executions of heretics were sermons in fire. Flames consumed the body as chants rose, reminding the crowd that heresy was not only crime but contagion. To see a man burn was to see the soul's damnation mirrored in flesh. Yet some in the crowd whispered differently. They admired courage, remembered defiance, told stories of martyrs rather than criminals. The theatre could be double-edged. Children grew up with these images, carried them into adulthood. Markets paused, guilds closed, whole towns gathered to watch. Execution was woven into daily life, not as hidden shame but as public teaching. The law was visible, tangible, unforgettable. But theatre carries risk. The more people watched, the more they judged. Some crowds grew restless, angry at cruelty. Others turned executions into carnival, cheering not justice but blood. The Church feared this, tried to frame every act with prayer, with solemnity, with ritual. But human eyes saw more than intended, and memory twisted verdicts in ways law could not control. The theatre of execution reminds us that medieval justice did not end in parchment or courtrooms. It ended in spectacle, in fire and rope, in the silence of a crowd that both feared and questioned what it saw. Law demanded obedience, but the people's memory was its own judge, and in that tension, every execution lived on long after the smoke had vanished. The hall was vast, its walls hung with tapestries of saints and martyrs, its floor echoing beneath armoured feet. At the far end sat the Pope, not in crown but in mitre, holding no sword but a staff. Before him stood a king, robes heavy with gold thread, crown tilted in his hands. The image was stark. Temporal power bowed before spiritual. Medieval kings claimed their thrones by blood, by conquest, by coronation. But in the eyes of the Church, their crowns rested on fragile ground. No matter their armies, no matter their wealth, they were still subject to the authority of Peter's successor. When kings defied Rome, they found themselves summoned, judged, condemned not by soldiers, but by words. The confrontation between Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII marked this truth most vividly. The investiture controversy, it was called, who held the right to appoint bishops, the king or the pope? Henry claimed the crown gave him power over the church in his realm. Gregory thundered back that spiritual authority lay with Rome alone. The quarrel ended with Henry, barefoot in the snow at Canossa, waiting 3 days for absolution. A king humbled before the pope, but such moments were not rare. Kings across Europe found themselves excommunicated, their subjects released from obedience, their power fractured by papal decree. John of England felt it when Innocent III declared him unfit to rule. Frederick II felt it when he was condemned as heretic and traitor. The Pope's words carried armies of their own, armies of conscience, of loyalty, of fear. Trials of kings were not like those of peasants. They were not held in village halls, but in councils, in synods, in vast assemblies. Charges were read aloud: heresy, sacrilege, defiance. Evidence was less about deeds and more about loyalty. Did the king obey the Pope? Did he bend to Rome's will? The verdicts often came before the trials began, shaped by politics as much as law. Yet the sight of kings judged by priests shook the world. It showed that crowns were not absolute, that even the highest stood under higher authority. For ordinary people, it was both awe and confusion. How could the one anointed by God be condemned by another man? And yet, how could the shepherd of souls do less? Kings resisted. They gathered loyal bishops, summoned councils of their own, denounced the Pope's authority. They wielded armies to press their claims, but every act of defiance carried risk. The Church could close churches, stop sacraments, silence bells. Without these, kings looked weak. No sword could strike against silence in every village. The memory of these confrontations shaped centuries. They taught that power was never singular, that thrones and altars wrestled constantly for supremacy. The trials of kings before popes revealed the fragile balance of medieval order. Neither crown nor mitre stood secure alone. Each sought to dominate, each needed the other. In the end, kings often regained strength, popes often bent, but the image remained: a king barefoot in snow, a crown held low, a pope lifting his hand in judgment. It was theatre as powerful as any execution, and its echo lasted long after the halls had emptied. In the labyrinth of medieval justice, one figure always stood apart. Bishops could be judged, priests punished, kings condemned. But the Pope himself, the supreme pontiff, the successor of Peter, stood above all. No court claimed authority over him. No council could bind him unless he consented. He was law, not subject to it. This immunity was not simply tradition, it was doctrine. The Pope held the plenitudo potestatis, the fullness of power. If all authority in the Church flowed from Peter, then Peter's successor could not be judged by those who received their authority from him. Prima sedes anemone judicatur, the canonists wrote, the first see is judged by no one. In practice, this meant that papal actions, however contested, were beyond formal trial. If a pope excommunicated a king, no one could annul it but himself. If he seized lands, appointed bishops, demanded tithes, no court could restrain him. His words became law the moment they left his lips, sealed with wax, copied across Christendom. Critics whispered. Some said this power was dangerous, unchecked, prone to abuse. They pointed to popes who lived lavishly, who waged wars, who twisted law for politics. They asked, who judges the judge? But the law's answer was always the same, God alone. The Pope would answer in heaven, not on earth. This immunity created tension. Councils at times tried to limit papal authority, claiming collective judgment. Reformers argued that no man should be beyond law. Yet, in the medieval world, these efforts rarely succeeded. The papacy defended its supremacy fiercely, citing scripture, tradition, precedent. To challenge it was to risk excommunication, exile, or worse. The result was paradox. The Pope was shepherd of justice, yet beyond its reach. He presided over trials of kings, but never faced trial himself. His pen decreed punishments, but never signed his own. His court condemned others, while his own actions remained beyond earthly judgment. For ordinary people, this made the papacy both awe-inspiring and suspect. They saw the Pope as vicar of Christ, guardian of salvation, voice of God. But they also saw him as man flawed, ambitious, sometimes corrupt. The contradiction was clear. How could the one above law still be bound to justice? The answer lay in faith, not in court. Above the law, the Pope stood as symbol of the Church's claim to universality. He embodied a justice not tied to human systems, but to divine authority. Yet this very claim planted seeds of doubt. If no one could judge him, what happened when he erred? If law could not touch him, who could? The medieval world lived with this tension, never resolving it. Popes reigned, councils gathered, kings resisted, reformers murmured, but the principle endured. The first see is judged by none. And in that principle lay both the strength and the fragility of the Church. For to be above the law is not only power, it is also burden. It leaves no earthly check, no human correction. It places all hope in the integrity of one man, one office, one voice. And history shows, again and again, how heavy such a burden can be. In the end, the Pope above the law reveals the central truth of medieval justice, that power and judgment were never equal, never balanced. The Church could judge all, yet stood beyond judgment itself. And in that imbalance lay both the awe and the unease that defined the age. The parchment was thick, treated with care, its surface smooth beneath the quill. The letters were drawn in deliberate strokes of black ink, Latin words dense and measured, their weight greater than any sword. At the bottom hung a disc of lead, pressed with the images of Saints Peter and Paul. This was no ordinary letter. It was a bull, a papal decree, a voice from Rome that carried law across kingdoms. Bulls were the lifeblood of papal justice. They transformed decisions into commands, judgments into binding law. A bull could excommunicate a king, summon a council, grant privileges, or condemn heresy. Once sealed, It travelled outward from the Vatican, carried by messengers, read aloud in cathedrals, posted on church doors. Wherever it arrived, it became law, regardless of local custom or resistance. The language of bulls was carefully crafted. Each began with a solemn invocation, in nomine Domini. The words framed authority not as personal but divine. The Pope did not write as man but as vicar of Christ, successor of Peter. What followed was legal, precise, and often merciless. A bull rarely wasted words. It named, commanded, condemned. No ambiguity was left for those who heard it. The people feared bulls. They could arrive without warning, overturning lives overnight. A town excommunicated for resisting tithes, a noble stripped of lands, a bishop recalled to Rome all by a few lines of ink. The lead seal gave it permanence. To break it was to defy Rome itself. Judges leaned on bulls in their trials. A case might be decided not by evidence but by reference to a papal decree. A bull condemning heresy left no room for doubt. The accused was guilty by definition. Bulls streamlined law, eliminating local debate. They were the net that Gregory IX had envisioned, woven tighter with each new decree. But bulls also bred resentment. Kings saw them as interference, nobles as theft of power, villagers as intrusion. When Innocent III issued the bull Innocentium against King John of England, it not only humiliated the king, but destabilized the realm. Bulls could unite Christendom under Rome, but they could also fracture it into rebellion. Scribes who copied bulls learned to fear their power. A miswritten phrase, a missing seal, could alter judgment. Some bulls were forged, used by ambitious clerics to seize land or silence rivals. Rome fought this with new seals, stricter records, but forgery lingered, another shadow cast by the language of power. The language of bulls reveals the central paradox of medieval justice. It was both universal and distant. The Pope's words reached villages he would never see, yet those villages rarely had voice in return. Law was not argued, it was proclaimed, and once proclaimed, it stood until revoked by another bull. For those who lived under their shadow, bulls were both terrifying and awe-inspiring. They were proof that the Pope's authority stretched across mountains and seas, binding kings and peasants alike. They were also proof that justice could arrive in silence, sealed in lead, changing lives with no more than a flick of the quill. The word itself was poison, heresy. To speak it was to summon fear, to whisper danger. Heresy was not merely error, it was betrayal. It was a wound in the body of Christendom, a disease that threatened to spread if not cut away. In the courts of the Church, heresy became the most dreaded charge of all. What made heresy terrifying was its invisibility. A thief could be caught, a murderer tracked, but a heretic might live among neighbours unnoticed, sharing bread by day, denying the faith by night. The Church described it as contagion, a plague of the soul. One heretic might corrupt a village corrupt a region, until faith itself was poisoned. Trials of heresy were unlike others. They did not focus on actions, but on beliefs. The accused was asked not what he had done, but what he thought, what he believed in his heart. Did he reject the sacraments? Did he question the authority of Rome? Did he deny Christ's presence in the Eucharist? Questions pierced deeper than deeds, reaching into the soul. The inquisitor's table became central here. Heresy was rarely confessed freely. Accusations came from neighbours, whispers in villages, rumours from rivals. The accused often denied it, knowing the weight of the charge. But denial was dangerous. Persistence was seen as obstinacy as proof. Confession was salvation, denial was damnation. Punishments varied. The penitent heretic might be reconciled, given penance, ordered to pilgrimage. The unrepentant faced imprisonment or death. Burning was common, the flames symbolizing purification, the body destroyed to save the soul. Crowds gathered, told that heresy threatened them all, reminded that justice demanded fire. The spectre of heresy reached beyond trials. It shaped communities. Villagers grew suspicious of one another, quick to report odd behaviour, unusual prayers, absence from Mass. Fear bred division. Accusation became weapon, sometimes wielded for revenge, sometimes for gain. The courts knew this but pressed on, convinced that better to condemn the innocent than let the guilty escape. Yet heresy was not always hidden. Sometimes it spread openly, movements forming in defiance of Rome. The Cathars in Languedoc, the Waldensians in the Alps. These groups challenged sacraments, questioned authority, lived lives of radical simplicity. Their defiance forced Rome to act not only with courts, but with armies. The Albigensian crusade turned suspicion into war, heresy into battlefield. The language of heresy infected even politics. Kings accused rivals of heresy to weaken them. Bishops denounced lords, lords denounced bishops. The charge became as much tool as truth. Once labelled heretic, a man's defence was nearly impossible. His property could be seized, his family disgraced, his life destroyed. Yet for all its terror, heresy also revealed cracks in the Church's authority. The very existence of heretics showed that obedience was not universal, that faith was not uniform. Each trial reminded the faithful that belief could diverge, that law could not silence every doubt. The spectre haunted not only the accused, but the accusers. The memory of heresy remains dark. It shows how deeply fear can shape justice, how suspicion can become weapon, how faith can turn into fire. It reminds us that in medieval courts, the greatest crime was not theft, not murder, but thought itself, the whisper of doubt, the spark of defiance, the refusal to believe as commanded. The records are thick with names of kings, bishops, heretics, nobles. Their trials are remembered, their verdicts studied, their punishments recorded. But beneath these famous cases lies another layer, quieter, often overlooked, the forgotten defendants. Farmers, widows, servants, children, ordinary people whose trials filled the courts day after day, whose stories rarely left the parchment. These defendants faced charges that seemed small compared to heresy or treason. Petty theft, broken vows, disputes over land, accusations of blasphemy or adultery. Yet for them, the consequences were life-altering. A stolen chicken could mean fines greater than a year's wages. A whispered insult against a priest could lead to public penance, humiliation before neighbours. The process was swift. The accused stood in small halls before local priests or bishops. Few had advocates, few understood the law. They answered as best they could, often in dialects different from the Latin of the court. Their words were translated, simplified, sometimes twisted. The scribes wrote in cold phrases, reducing lives to lines of accusation and verdict. For women, the danger was greater. Many stood accused of immorality, their voices doubted, their defences ignored. Widows without protectors were easy targets. Servants accused by masters had little chance. Trials reflected not equality but hierarchy. The poor bore burdens, the rich could escape. Yet, even in these cases, the Church sought not only punishment but control. Penances were imposed, prayers, fasts, small pilgrimages. These kept the faithful within the fold, reminded them that even minor sins were subject to law. The court was not only judge but teacher, shaping daily behaviour through constant discipline. The forgotten defendants rarely resisted. They could not afford appeal, could not summon papal legates, could not write to Rome. Their trials ended where they began, in small towns, in minor halls, before judges whose faces they knew. Justice was close, familiar, inescapable. Their stories rarely reach us. The records preserve names, fines, penances, but little of their voices. We know them only as lines. Martha, accused of theft, confessed. Peter, accused of blasphemy, absolved with penance. The humanity beneath is lost, erased by ink. And yet, in their silence, they reveal the true scale of medieval justice. For every king deposed, 100 villagers were fined. For every heretic burned, 1,000 peasants confessed. The courts touched not only the mighty but the ordinary, binding Christendom together in webs of law that stretched into every home. The forgotten defendants remind us that law was not spectacle alone. It was daily life, constant, ordinary, unavoidable. It judged bread and chickens as much as crowns and heresies. And though their names fade, their trials were the true fabric of medieval justice, the countless threads that made the great tapestry of law hold together. The door was iron, heavy, designed not only to close but to silence. Beyond it, narrow corridors twisted like veins in stone, leading to cells barely large enough for a man to lie flat. These were the papal prison structures hidden within fortresses and palaces, places where judgment did not end in execution but in confinement. They were not always spoken of in chronicles, yet they were as much a tool of papal law as excommunication or bulls. To be cast into a papal prison was to vanish from the world. A condemned cleric, a heretic who had repented but could not be trusted, a bishop guilty of disobedience, all might find themselves locked behind its walls. Unlike the dungeons of kings, papal prisons carried a spiritual purpose. They were not meant only to punish the body, but to reform the soul. The Church insisted that confinement was correction, that silence, fasting, and prayer could cure the sickness of disobedience. The reality was harsher. The cells were cold, damp, often underground. Light reached only through slits. Food was plain, water limited. Prisoners passed days in monotony, with only prayers and memories for company. Some scribbled on walls, carving prayers or names into stone, leaving behind the faintest record of their existence. Others fell into silence, so complete it seemed the prison itself had swallowed their voices. The papal prison was not always permanent. Some prisoners were released after years of penance, returned to monasteries under watch. Others were transferred, passed from one bishop's care to another's. But many never left, their lives ending in stone chambers, their bodies buried without ceremony. Unlike executions, which were public, prison was hidden. Its silence was its power. What set papal prisons apart was their authority. No king could intervene, no local court could override. Once condemned to confinement by papal decree, the prisoner belonged entirely to Rome. Appeals were meaningless. The Pope himself was the only door to freedom. This gave prisons a special weight. They were not merely punishment, but proof of papal supremacy. Legends grew around certain prisons, like Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, tower and fortress. It loomed over the Tiber, its walls a symbol of both papal protection and papal captivity. To see its massive bulk was to remember that the Pope could command not only the soul, but the body, binding even the highest within stone. Yet these prisons were not filled with endless crowds. They held the few rather than the many. Most offenders were given penance or exile. Prison was reserved for those who carried risk men, whose freedom could spread heresy, stir rebellion, or challenge papal authority. The few who entered carried great weight. Their silence was a warning to all. The papal prison reveals a subtler side of medieval justice. It was not always fire and spectacle, not always bulls and councils. Sometimes it was stone, silence, and time. Sometimes the Church punished not by destroying but by containing, holding lives in narrow cells until memory itself grew faint. For those who lived under its shadow, the prison was more feared than gallows. Death came swiftly, but prison lingered. Death was public, but prison erased. To be sentenced there was to be forgotten, not above law, not beneath it, but locked within it forever.